Well, hey, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Text Messages, a podcast out of First Christian Church of Huntington Beach. My name is Stephen Pate. I'm on staff here at the church. I'm joined once again with our lead pastor, Scott Martin. Scott, it's great to see you.
Stephen, good to see you too, man.
Thanks for joining us. We are in episode 10 of our podcast, and it is February 2021. This is our second episode of February. And, there's been a lot going on over the past year and just, with the world and what we do for entertainment. A lot of things have changed, and I have found myself consuming a lot of content online, and especially just watching a lot of TV. I try to do other things, but I do watch a lot of TV. I have binge watched several shows, and I'm just wondering, is there any show that you and the family have watched at the beginning of 2021, or maybe it started in 2020, that you just thought, hey, this was a great show. We binge watched it. We loved it. I just want to know what that is for you guys.
So, what I finally started watching, you recommended it to me a while ago on this podcast, was Cobra Kai.
Yes, Cobra Kai.
And I've caught up. I've watched all of them. And I liked it. Just at the point where, if you've never seen it, it's super 80s. It's kind of cheesy, kind of cornball, but a lot of fun. And so I finally caught up on Cobra Kai. And then I'm pretty sure you've been watching this too, but as a family, all four of us watch now WandaVision.
Oh, very cool.
That on Fridays. Yeah, even my daughter's gotten into that too, and that's a fun, interesting show. It's Marvel's, for those of you who don't watch it, it's Marvel's first streaming show on the Disney Plus platform.
Yeah, that's the one I was gonna say, that we've been watching WandaVision and kind of diving in, and it took first couple episodes I was really confused. Marissa was having to explain some of the stuff to me. I was just like, what's happening? And then with some of the more recent ones, not to spoil anything if you're listening, you haven't watched it yet, but then it kind of starts to unpack a little bit more of what's happening. So that's a great one.
The first one's like a 50s sitcom, and the second one's like a 60s sitcom, and you're like, what? What? But then just stick with it till about episode 3 or 4. Yeah, it's good.
Don't give up. Yeah, keep watching.
If it seems confusing, it's supposed to be.
Yeah, it's intentional. Oh man, that's a good one. That's one of my favorites. Another one. This is like my guilty pleasure show. I feel like we have some of those sometimes, just like the shows we watch for fun. And a show that I've watched for so many years is Hell's Kitchen. Have you ever seen that with Gordon Ramsay? Yeah. The cooking competition, And I don't know what it is about that show. It just, it makes me laugh. He gets so upset, and you see all sorts of things happen. But we are watching that show right now. The latest season is actually in Vegas instead of California. It's a little different, but yeah. Hell's Kitchen. It's been on forever. And
my kids taught me there's a meme they love from there where he calls someone an idiot sandwich. Have you ever seen that? There's a scene, and they showed it to me, and he's up in her face. He's like, "What are you, an idiot sandwich?" So I've seen a few episodes of Hell's Kitchen, but every time I think of Hell's Kitchen, I just think of Gordon Ramsay yelling that someone's an idiot sandwich.
There's some people that just end up making great memes, like he's one of them, I think, just because he's a very colorful character and gets very upset. But then he seems like this really nice guy, in real, outside of the kitchen, he just seems like he's so kind. I don't know, but good times. Well, hey, we're not just going to talk about that today. We do have a topic that we're going to dive into. And, February is a month that's known for a lot of different things. We just did an episode before about love. Another thing that's interesting about February is that there is a church tradition that actually begins around this time that's called Lent. And so we're gonna talk a little bit about what Lent is and just some ways to understand it. But before we get to that, I thought it would be important for us to kind of talk a little bit about who we are as FCC. There might be people listening right now that are like, what is Lent? Or maybe I've heard of that. And there's all sorts of different churches out there, lots of different denominations, and you can walk down the street in Huntington Beach and you can find, many different churches all over, a different church on different street corner. But kind of who are we as a church? How do we kind of understand sort of our traditions and just sort of the identity that we have as FCC? If you can kind of start us with there, and then we'll transition and talk a little bit about Lent.
Yeah. So most Christian churches, like churches that follow Jesus, fall into a category that we refer to as denominations. Mm-hmm. And usually they'll have the name of the denomination in the church. It'll be like Presbyterian or Baptist or Methodist. Denomination, that word simply refers to a category. I tried to think of the two times we use denomination, and we use it to talk about churches, and we use it to talk about money. Because you're talking about money, it's like, what's the denomination? I have bills. What's the denomination of the bill?
Yeah.
And so denomination is just a category. So when you talk about a Christian denomination, it's a a category of churches with a central leadership. So that's what your denominations have in common, is that they will have some kind of central denominational leadership that makes choices regarding, policy and things like that for the whole denomination. And so a lot of times the churches will work together, and finances or things may be shared between the denomination and the churches. Some denominations even make the assignments of where the pastors go within the denomination. Our church is what's known as an independent Christian church. And if you're at all curious, I tell people this all the time, you can actually Google the Stone Campbell movement. Okay. There's like a Wikipedia page and all this kind of stuff, because that's where we came from. And it started with Bart Stone, and then Alexander and Thomas Campbell, who were a father and a son. And they were both, all three of them were denominational preachers. Mm-hmm. They were ministers. They were, if I remember right, they were all Presbyterian.
Presbyterians, right?
Yeah. And at that point, this is like the 1800s, everything was getting so divided. And really what happened is the Campbells and then Stone just kind of got tired of all the denominational fighting, because churches would break off for any one reason. And they just kind of got tired of it. And so what they wanted to start is they wanted to just start a unity movement. Mm. They wanted to drop all the little things that churches would divide over that they really thought of as, but these aren't essential.
Yeah.
And so we just want to focus on the things that are essential. The Stone Campbell movement kind of traces its origins back to this event known as the Cane Ridge Revival, which happens in Kentucky. And there's like 20,000 people that go to it. And it's this crazy thing. And Stone speaks there. And it just kind of is the birthplace of this movement that becomes known as the Stone Campbell movement, or sometimes it's called the Restoration Movement.
Yeah.
And again, their goal was to kind of strip away all the division that denominations had caused. And they wanted to get back to what they saw as kind of the simplicity of the New Testament church. Mm-hmm. And so they had all these different slogans. One of their big slogans is, "We're not the only Christians, we're Christians only."
Yeah.
They dropped all those denominational titles like Methodist or Presbyterian or Baptist or whatever, and they just went with Christian. And their whole point was, listen, we're not saying we're the only people that follow Christ. We're just saying that's all we want to be known by, because all those other things, like Presbyterian is a way to refer to like presbyteries, and Baptist has to do with, what you think about baptism, and Methodist comes from so those all signify different things. And they were like, we want to drop all of those identities, and we just want to be only Christians. That's what defines us, that we follow Jesus. They had other slogans like, where the Bible speaks, we speak; where the Bible is silent, we're silent. No creed but Christ. Because what you find in a lot of denominations, and if you're from a Catholic background, you would know this, that there's creeds that you recite. The Apostles' Creed is kind of a famous one. And again, it's not that Stone and Campbell's said that, creeds are, evil or of the devil, but it was just, no, we want to drop all that, and we just want to focus on Jesus. Mm-hmm. Another one of the big ones was, in essentials, unity, and non-essentials, liberty, and all things love. So they were trying to create this independent, non-denominational unity movement. That was their goal. What's funny is now, this was like in the 1800s, like 1860s or something is when it started, if I remember right. Is that right? I'm going with that in mind. Yeah, I think so. I kind of think so. Yeah. And so, they want to start that, but in some ways it's kind of become a denomination, non-denomination type thing. Ultimately, what comes out of the Stone Campbell movement is now three kind of separate movements. Mm-hmm. One is the Disciples of Christ, that actually became an official denomination. Mm-hmm. The other is the Churches of Christ, if you're familiar with that. And Churches of Christ non-instrumentals, a lot of them, not all of them, are non-instrumental.
Yeah.
And then what's known as the Independent Christian Church, mm-hmm. which is kind of the background that our church is from. And so there's other churches around. You used to work at Eastside Christian Church in Anaheim. That's an independent, non-denominational Christian church. My home church, where you were youth pastor, Downey First Christian Church. There's other churches around like that, but we're not referred to as a denomination. Sometimes we have gatherings within the movement, but they're not for deciding any kind of policy. They're not for deciding any kind of structure. They're more just, let's get together, let's worship, let's have some teaching, let's encourage one another, let's hang out. But we are entirely self-governing, which mm-hmm. means for us, at First Christian Church, we always say that no one outside of 1207 Main Street tells us what to do or what not to do. That's our address. And so we have elders, we have a board, we have our staff, we are completely self-governing. And so we make all of our own choices and decisions when it comes to who we are, what we're going to do, all that kind of stuff. So like I said, if you want to read more, you can Google Stone Campbell movement. You can Google Restoration movement. Most of the stuff you'll find is pretty accurate. Some of it is a little off. Some of it's other people's interpretations of things, but that's a little bit about our background.
Yeah. And that's super helpful. Thank you for unpacking that. And, you know, we are that independent church. And so there isn't like some board that, you know, is across the country that's making decisions kind of about what we do. And that's important because in sometimes in churches of different denominations, they do have those governing boards, and even down to kind of what people are preaching on. Sometimes that can be kind of determined by just sort of what everyone is doing. And that really kind of brings up this idea of Lent, that Lent is kind of part of the liturgical background of a lot of churches. And you find this kind of in Catholic churches, but also different Protestant churches that kind of operate off of a liturgical calendar. And we certainly do some of that. And by liturgical calendar, we're kind of talking about like the traditional church calendar. And so, I mean, we celebrate Christmas, we celebrate Easter, and there's some other things we highlight, but we don't always necessarily have following that as kind of the driving force, you know, kind of for what we do. But we have this thing called Lent that comes up. And I think it's one of these church practices where there's a lot of interesting things that we can learn kind of about that and adopt in our own lives in kind of you know, the way that we kind of feel led to do. So I wanted to share a little bit about sort of what kind of Lent is, and then for us to talk a little bit about how might someone want to approach it. You know, how might they find this season to be one of growing closer to God, and what are some practices that maybe you'd want to adopt just during this season of preparing for Easter. So like for me, this is kind of interesting because I actually grew up going to a Catholic school. So I was raised in a Christian church, a non-denominational Christian church like FCC in Portland, Oregon, where I grew up. But my mom enrolled me in a Catholic grade school. So from 1st to 8th grade, I went to Catholic school. And so growing up, I always like participated in Lent because that was like what I had to do. and I remember like certain things like really stood out for me. Like we'd always kind of talk about something we were going to give up. And I'd always notice like my classmates, you know, would give up things. And, you know, if anyone listening, if you maybe grew up Catholic or a part of a different church, like you might have remember kind of doing those things. So it was like, you know, maybe it was going to be candy or soda or video games. I remember I had a teacher like in 5th grade who gave up drinking coffee for Lent. And at the time, I didn't think anything of it. Now I'm wondering, wow, that would be a really challenging thing to do as a teacher, to give up your caffeine consumption. I don't know how she did it. So very, very holy person, I guess. But, you know, growing up, that was kind of like a big thing. And we always had this party every year before the beginning of Lent. It's called Fat Tuesday. And it was sort of like, that's what Mardi Gras is. Like, it's kind of this big celebration. So we did our own, like, very tamed down version of what that is. Like, that was just like snacks and a party. And then you would kind of go into this season that was really, it kind of felt like it was really like almost self-denial, like that. Like, it was really kind of full of just like quieting down. And there was really a sense of like, this is an intense thing. And that's certainly part of it. But I was missing a lot of that just as kind of a young kid. So I wanted to share a little bit about just sort of how we might understand Lent and some of the history and origins of it. And then again, kind of connect that to some optional things that people might want to do during this season as they follow Jesus. So if you have any questions, chime in, Scott, but I'll begin by just talking about like, why is it called Lent, right? That's kind of an interesting word. And that just comes from a word Lenten, meaning spring. That's because essentially it happens in the spring. So why it happens in the spring is our biggest celebration as Christians happens in the spring, which is, of course, Easter, right? And we celebrate Jesus' resurrection. That happens in the springtime because that's when Passover happened, was in the springtime. And that's when Jesus was, you know, put on trial and died and resurrected. And so that kind of begins the whole idea of why it happens when it does. And historically, what Lent was about was really people were preparing to be baptized. And it was like this period of time where they would go through something that was known as a catechism, which is like a teaching. So it was like people who were preparing to be like followers of Jesus, sort of traditionally kind of within the Catholic Church and other denominations. They would go through this period of time where they're like reflecting on what that meant to convert to Christianity. And that would sort of lead them to Easter Sunday, which is when they would be baptized. So it was kind of this season that was really marked by like, examining yourself and preparing yourself. And usually there was like prayer and fasting that was kind of part of all this process. Now, with any like church traditions, there's usually like different opinions on the exact origins. But if you're looking at the Bible, it doesn't say anything about Lent. Okay, you will not find that in the Bible. And that has a lot to do with kind of what you're talking about with who we are as a movement, that, we really say what we do is based on, what the Bible says or it doesn't say. And so you won't find Lent in the Bible. If you do find it, please let us know, because that would be a pretty incredible thing. I want to check the translation of the Bible that you're using, see which one it is. But the tradition of it begins really with the story of Jesus, by looking at Jesus's life and sort of what he went through. And the period of time for Lent is 40 days. And it starts 40 days before Easter, whenever Easter Sunday is, not counting Sunday. So it's like 40 days during the week that lead up to Easter. And 40 is this number that we see all over in the Bible. Like, and it's a pretty significant number. It represents, times of trials and testing, but it also is just kind of a long period of time. And, Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Moses goes up on Mount Sinai for 40 days. And then Jesus, in Matthew's gospel, Matthew 4, he's tested in the wilderness. He fasts for 40 days before he begins his ministry. And so the idea of 40 just kind of came from there, like it's this season of preparation, and it kind of mimics Jesus' own preparation for ministry. And so that's sort of what began that tradition. Church history is such an interesting thing to like look back. And, you mentioned Googling earlier, so you can find some things. I think when you Google, there's this church father named Irenaeus, who supposedly was one of the first people that wrote about Lent, and this was kind of, a really long time ago, where he began to kind of talk a little bit about this season. And then there was this thing called the Council of Nicaea that, is kind of a famous gathering, one of several famous gatherings where, the church was kind of hammering out some things, and, certain books of the Bible were being organized and heresies were being dealt with. And also during this time is when they think kind of like Easter was defined as to sort of like when that would be. And then the official season of Lent kind of began during that time. So there's a lot of stuff, just sort of the background of it, but it is kind of interesting to think of how certain church traditions developed and then how they become applied in our lives.
Yeah. And I think going back to talking about our movement, one of the weaknesses of our movement is we kind of almost just draw our beginnings to the 1860s. Because then Campbell and Stone, their whole kind of thing was, well, like, we've gotten it so wrong, let's drop everything and let's just focus forward. And so in some ways, and I almost think it's like subconscious, but the subconscious attitude of the Stone Campbell movement is, well, everything prior to that was wrong, so let's just focus on then forward. So we don't put a lot of emphasis on stuff in church history like Lent or like some of the early church fathers or like some of that, because we just look at it and go, yeah, it kind of got sidetracked. Like in the New Testament, it was great, but then after the New Testament period, everything got messed up.
Right.
It got fixed by the Campbells and Stone. And yeah, like the more I've studied church history, yeah, there's things in there that, I disagree with, or there's things in there it's like, well, that was dumb, we shouldn't have done that. But there's a lot in there that's really good. And so I think for someone like me, or for those of us who are part of what might be a newer church tradition, the benefit of that is we're not tied into the tradition, because sometimes tradition gets so overbearing. Some of us, I'm sure, have been a part of church traditions that are just, the traditional part of it is so overbearing, it takes everything away. We don't have that. We're kind of freed from that, but we also lose a little bit, because there is something in some of those traditions, like you're talking about with Lent, that go back, and Christians for centuries have done this and benefited, and there's deep spiritual meaning, and there's some really cool things that we could recover if we got back into some of that. So
yeah, I love that you said that, Scott, because I think that there is something about knowing that we are freed from some of those traditions, especially when they're performed in a very legalistic way that, is not really what the freedom of Christ is about. But then we're also able to enter back into those and think through some of these kind of ancient practices that were really beneficial and helpful, and find new ways to imagine them in our lives. Wow, that's a great insight. So we have kind of this official beginning of Lent at some point in church history that, kind of began. And then, that sort of developed into the way that was practiced. Lent begins really with something that's called Ash Wednesday. And if anyone is curious, it is Wednesday, February 17th of 2021. And you've probably seen people on this day and maybe been confused because they've had like ash on their foreheads and the sign of a cross. I remember being out to lunch with a student of mine and when I was a youth pastor, and we were like in and out, and there were a lot of people that came in that had, the ash, and he just was like confounded by this. Like, he had no idea what it was. He thought something really bad was taking place. And I kind of had to say, no, this is kind of the beginning of this season. And the ashes, at least kind of like historically, it's the old palm leaves from the Palm Sunday before that are burned. I don't know if churches necessarily do that now, but then putting the sign of the cross with ashes on your forehead is really sort of like this reminder of what it means to be human. The ashes representing dust, from dust you were made, to dust you will return. And so it really is kind of starting this season of preparation, just being like centered on the fact of like who we are, a reminder of our own limits as humans, and then kind of beginning, this journey of being prepared. Now, in ancient times, Lent really had two main ideas, and it was a season marked by prayer and by fasting. And, fasting is one of these things that it is a practice we see in the Bible, see in the Old Testament, see in the New Testament. It is a very beneficial practice. It's a difficult practice, and one that, there should be some caution with it, if you're going to do it. But that was really a big part of it. And that's where the whole idea of giving something up for Lent kind of came from, was this idea of fasting. And if you grew up maybe in, a Catholic church or a liturgical church, you probably can remember being told to give up something. And that's really connected to this idea of fasting. And people still today do that.
You mentioned the story of Jesus in the wilderness.
Yeah.
Part of Lent goes back to there, because when Jesus is in the wilderness, he's preparing, and we're told, Matthew tells us, he doesn't eat anything for 40 days.
Yeah.
That's part of his preparation. So it goes into Lent. Like, yeah, we're gonna give that thing up.
Yeah, exactly. And so it kind of mimics, what Jesus did, is sort of, hey, this is our own preparation, choosing to give something up during this season. And the whole idea behind, giving something up isn't just about like, hey, I'm going to really discipline myself and have some good self-denial. I think those are good things. Like, we need to make decisions against ourselves, but really it's about, hey, what am I going to replace that with? Like, what am I going to open up my life to? And Jesus is fasting in the wilderness. I mean, he centered his time on prayer, on just being attentive to God and not having those distractions. And so that kind of is behind that idea of, hey, let's give something up so that we can fill it with something else, so that we can really focus in on God.
And that's the important part of fasting.
Yeah.
That I think we miss, because I know a lot of people that don't necessarily celebrate Lent, but every time that time of year, they're like, oh, I'm going to give something up. And a lot of times it'll be a health thing. Like you said, like, I'm going to give up sugar because then I'll be in better shape. And when Easter comes, I can mow down on, ham and pie or whatever.
Yeah.
But the whole point of fasting, no matter when you do it, whether it's part of Lent or not, is, hey, when I have an urge for that thing, I'm going to instantly go to prayer. That I'm replacing that with something else. And like Stephen said, if you're gonna fast, you may want to talk to a doctor or something, because sometimes there's some of us that can't fast for different reasons, or just be a good idea. So, and fasting doesn't necessarily imply that you have to eat no food. Sometimes it's just, hey, I'm going to fast from this particular thing or that particular thing. Some people even do fasts where they eat when the sun goes down and they just don't eat when the sun's up. There's different ways you can do it. But again, like you said, the point is, the time that I would normally spend with this, I'm going to use that to focus on God. If we're just giving up, sugar, that's not bad. It's a healthy thing, but that's not the point of Lent. If we're just giving the thing up to give it up, then we're missing the bigger idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And finding out and experiencing what that bigger idea is, that's kind of part of it. As we open our hearts and we really reflect on Jesus's journey, which is a journey that we see that there's suffering and there's pain, but ultimately there's this victory that we're preparing ourselves for that celebration. But yeah, important, with the fasting, to make sure that you kind of do that in a safe way. And like you said, there's different ways you can do that. Traditionally, sometimes people give up, like meat on Fridays. It's kind of like a traditional thing.
Did your school do fish fries? Because that's a big thing at schools, like Catholic churches. You'll see it a lot.
So there actually was this like little hole in the wall fish restaurant that was around the corner from my school. And every like Friday, it would just be full of the teachers. And I remember going one time with my family, and I was like, I'm never going back here again, because all my teachers were in the same place having dinner, and it was just like, yeah, it was great. But so another part of Lent that is it's pretty fascinating is that we approach this time called Holy Week. And we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about that in a future episode. But you have really that final week of Jesus's life where you're reflecting on him going to the cross. And there's some really incredible things happening, in that week, from Palm Sunday and what that means to Maundy Thursday, which, talks about the Last Supper. And the word Maundy in Latin means command. And Jesus kind of telling what he's going to do in the Last Supper. And then Good Friday, which reflects on the fact that Jesus, went to the cross for us and what that looks like. And we have various ways that we celebrate that, and sometimes that's church services or just different reflections that we're doing. But that's a big part of Lent as well, is to think about those, and ultimately to celebrate Easter and the hope and new life we have because Jesus overcame sin and death, and he died, and then he came back for us. And that really is what Lent is about. Is it's arriving at Easter. It's arriving at that place of celebration, and just being able to share in that journey that Jesus took getting there. So that's kind of a lot of just sort of what Lent has been historically. And I think it's one of these things that happens every year, and it's an opportunity to think, hey, what might I do in this season to just encounter God in a deeper way? And what are maybe some practices that I could do during a season that has been a part of the church for so many years, to find just maybe a little more intimacy with God, to choose to set aside some time to encounter him. So we talked a little bit about, like fasting, or, giving something up in order that you can like fill that with another thing. Lent's also kind of about simplicity and just like realizing, hey, maybe I'm just really busy. We're all really busy. And so what are some things that maybe I can do just to be intentional with my time with family and friends, and just really to create that space for God? So I would love for us just to share a little bit about maybe just some ideas and some resources on what someone could do if they want to take this Lenten journey. If they want to say, hey, I'm going to just carve out some space to connect with God. And maybe somebody has participated in Lent before, or maybe they haven't, and this is just, hey, this is something you could check out, and take a look at that. So we talked about like prayer and scripture reading in a previous episode. So I'd encourage you, if you didn't listen to that one, to maybe kind of go back. But what about some other things that we could do, Scott? And I'd love to kind of hear what you think. Obviously, setting aside time to pray and read scripture, but maybe what are some other practices that we could do during this time to really open up our hearts to God's leading, and just to kind of reflect on who he is and how he's leading us to Easter? Yeah.
One thing, I was just curious. Sometimes we've talked about the Bible app. You can get it on your smart device. Like, it's from lifechurch.tv, the YouVersion Bible app. They do have on there a Lent reading plan for everyone. It's called Lent for Everyone, by N.T. Wright.
Oh, nice.
So I just throw that out there to like, hey, if you're looking for like a reading plan, I have not read through it, to be honest, but N.T. Wright is brilliant. So if you're looking for like, hey, what's something that could guide my scripture reading through Lent, check out that reading plan. You can download that app for free and do all that. But yeah, there's, we talk about like spiritual formation or spiritual disciplines, and there's a lot of those things. And again, those are things that you look back historically that Christians did for centuries, that I think in a lot of ways in our world, we've kind of lost touch with. And I think some of the reason we've lost touch with is exactly what you said, that we're busy, and, we get so much going on. We don't stop and think about it, because most of these spiritual disciplines, they take some amount of quiet, and they take some amount of reflection, and it takes time to pause.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I think that maybe this might be a great season for some of us to do Lent, because we're still, hopefully, signs are looking good that, COVID numbers are starting to come down, but we're still in this time where a lot of things are still closed down, and there's not a lot you can do. And so things move a little bit slower for most of us than they typically do. That may not be true for all of us, but I think it would be a great time this year for a lot of us to kind of seize on that.
Yeah.
And to even slow things down even a little bit more. Because part of spirituality is reminding ourselves that the world doesn't revolve around us, that it revolves around God. and God is in charge, and we can take time off, and so it's learning to live like in healthy rhythms.
Mm-hmm.
And so you said simplicity. I think simplicity is great. I think it's one of the great spiritual disciplines, because we live in this world where we just want everything to be more complex.
Yeah.
And so really look at your life and the way that you spend your time and the way that you spend your energy and the way that you spend your money, and really just ask yourself, like, what really do I not need? Because I guarantee there's stuff in all our lives. I guarantee there's stuff in my life that it's like, I just don't need it.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't, like, there's things that are fun. Like, we talked about TV shows. When I sit down to watch WandaVision with my family, that's fun. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's not, but there's all these other excess things that we just don't need. And they just take time, they take energy, they take resources. And so really sit down and look at your life and say, how can I simplify it? Because the other thing I'll tell you, if you don't do that, when everything opens back up, you're just going to get even crazier, because we're not really good at subtracting things. We're only good at adding things.
Yeah. Yeah.
But now's a great season to just literally go through life and what can we do less of? And hopefully, I hope that people have been seizing on the fact that they've had more time with their kids. As tough as this season has been, especially if you have a big family with a lot of kids, you're probably used to taking this kid to soccer and this kid to baseball and this kid to dance, and that, like, the simplicity of the schedule, like, allows us more time to connect with the relationships in our life, allows us more time to connect with God. And so even as things start to go back to being more open, don't commit yourself to as much. Keep your life simple, keep your schedule simple, because then you'll have more time. You'll have more time to connect with God. You'll have more time to connect with your family, with your loved ones, with your friends. You'll have more time to just enjoy a walk on the beach or whatever you want to do. I think that's a huge one. One of the reasons we get so stressed out in life is because we have no margin in our time and we have no margin in our money. We just spend ourselves so incredibly thin. Whereas if you create margin in your life, that's where good things happen. I know you already said that, and I'm just repeating you, but I think that would be a huge one for many of us, that would pay dividends in our spiritual life and even our other key relationships.
And why not, take this season of Lent to figure out, hey, how can I simplify some things? And when you do that, I love that you mentioned margin, creating margin in life, in finances, that creates freedom. That helps us be generous. That helps us be present. We're not just running around or having so many things happen. We can really invest in the people that are in front of us and feel like we can really kind of be open. And so I think that'd be a great thing to do during this season. Find some ways to simplify. Find a reading plan, possibly to work through that one by N.T. Wright. That'd be a great one to dive into and just kind of set aside that time to connect with God, to just be preparing your own heart, kind of listening to what God might be saying, what he might be revealing and teaching to you.
Yeah, because I think, and you've mentioned this, and I'll ask you this in a minute if you have any book recommendations.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of times when we talk about faith things, we tend to focus more on what we can do. And Lent to me has always had more of like I don't want to say this wrong, but almost like an internal thing.
Yeah.
Lent is more kind of about reflecting. It's not so much, and again, I'm not saying that you shouldn't go out and serve people. I think we should always go out and serve people. I think we should always, faith is active. And we talked about that in our last podcast, that love is active. It's about what you do. But Lent is really a lot about preparing our hearts and our lives for the anticipation of what God is going to do through resurrection.
Yeah.
And so to really take that time to, hey, what can I do in my own life to develop that? You had mentioned, I'll ask you, is there like some books that you might recommend that might be good for people to read?
Yeah. I did write down two that just for me, they kind of have been books that have like guided me. And I know not everyone's like a big reader, but I think if you find a book that you like, you find it on, Audible or whatever you want to listen to it. But one's called Abba's Child by Brendan Manning. And it's not a super long book, but it really is just kind of this incredible example of like God's love. And if you've ever read anything by him before, he just has a lot of stories. I love reading stories. And so just kind of talking about just the power of God's love and how that shapes our identity, and really kind of going through that process of having your identity shaped. And another one that I would recommend is a very simple, very small book called Life with the Beloved by Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen's someone that we both have mentioned a lot. We've both quoted him, I know, in numerous messages, but just a phenomenal writer and a simple writer. Like his books are really easy to read. And that one, Life of the Beloved, he wrote it towards someone who didn't have any like faith background and just said, I want to convince you of who God is and how much he loves you and what your identity is. And it's just a phenomenal book. And wherever you're at in your spiritual journey, that one is super powerful. So I'd suggest those two. Do you have any that you might suggest, or one that you might suggest?
I was thinking through one of the books that I have really loved, and I feel bad because I always mention him, but N.T. Wright wrote a book called Surprised by Hope.
Yeah.
And just the idea of thinking about how, Lent ultimately leads to Easter, which is a celebration of resurrection. N.T. Wright's a biblical scholar, so it's a lot of, there's a lot of like Bible stuff there, but it's really about what is resurrection all about, and what is the hope that we have because of the resurrection. And so to me, that book, there was a lot of things that he said in there that blew me away, that got me thinking, that helped me reframe like what resurrection really means in Jesus and in my own life and in the world. So just as a way to approach Easter, I think that's a great book. But yeah, like you said, Brennan Manning and Henry Nouwen, incredible writers, both brilliant people that have the gift of making complex things seem so simple.
Yeah, which is really helpful for me. I love that.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much. That's a great recommendation. And I would offer one more, and this is a little bit of a plug for something we do at FCC, but we're starting this new round of Growth Track, and we've talked a little bit about that, but Growth Track is this online experience where you come and you learn some content, you get to share with people and talk with people. And we're doing a study on the book of Exodus, and we're actually starting that on the 15th of February, and it'll end by Easter. So if you're looking for something to do over Lent, you got this period of time, about 40 days, where you can go through that study, and you'll hear from some of our FCC staff members, including you, Scott. And we'll talk a little bit about that book and the connections in our lives. So I'd encourage you to check that out if you're looking for something to do during Lent, besides some of those other things that we mentioned. Well, thank you so much.
Like you said, even though Exodus is an Old Testament story, it's foundational to understanding the New Testament. So much of the way Jesus is presented has to do with how Moses is presented, and Jesus is like leading a new Exodus. So even though we're talking about an Old Testament story, it's very much foundational to understanding the New Testament. So I really encourage you to go through that. I think it'd be a great experience.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's perfect. So thank you for saying that, because reading through Exodus and finding those connections, that'll lead you to Easter, right? And what that is all about. That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for talking through Lent and kind of what that is. And, if you're listening or watching right now, we'd encourage you, maybe think about what that might look like during the season as we just kind of prepare ourselves, as we follow Christ, as we get ready for Easter and get ready to celebrate. And it'd be an incredible thing to do. If you've done it in the past or you've never done it, maybe this is an opportunity just to try something new. But thank you, Scott, so much for being here. Appreciate
Hey, thank you for sharing all your Lent experience, man. You got a lot more than I do. So
you're welcome. And everyone else, thanks so much again for being here. We look forward to seeing you next time on Text Messages. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Grace and peace.
God bless you all. Take care.